How we doing, Lena? Are we all set?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. Okay. So just to give you a little bit of information about ecomaine, if you're a little unfamiliar with us or not sure about all of the things that we do, we are a nonprofit organization. We are municipally owned, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And we're owned by 20 Maine municipalities. So a lot of them focused in southern Maine. I'll show you a map in just a second as well to show you where in Maine all of those towns are. And we manage solid waste. We call it municipal solid waste, or MSW, and recycling. So your household recyclables, your household trash, those two things come to ecomaine and we process them in different ways. So we've got 3 facilities that we use to manage all of this discarded material. So we service about 400,000 people in the state of Maine through our recycling program, through our waste program, or for both programs together. We take in about 175,000 tons of trash every year and about 35,000 tons of recycling every year. We could certainly take more recycling. We want to get that stuff out of the trash, and we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. But you can see here, we've got the photos. The waste to energy facility is right on Outer Congress Street in Portland. It's actually right next to Highway 95. So you can see that picture in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see the highway in the top of that picture, and then the waste to energy and our big giant stacks on the bottom corner. And then just next door is our recycling center. So kind of cool little fun fact, that building is recycled in and of itself. That used to be a transfer station for trash where folks would bring their garbage to be crushed up and then sent to the landfill. We're not doing that anymore. When we built the waste to energy plant, that building was empty. It didn't have a job. So we kind of repurposed it, and we're using it now to process all of our recyclables. And now we've even added all of this really cool sorting equipment that you're going to see in the video soon. So this building in and of itself is recycled, and that's kind of neat. It's a little piece of history for us. And then a last facility that we manage and operate is our ash fill, or our landfill space. So I'll talk about landfilling in just a minute. But basically what we do here is a little bit different because we're burning the trash in the waste to energy plant. It's getting combusted at about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's being reduced to that ash. So that takes up much less space in a landfill, and that's what we're putting into the landfill today. You can look at Google Maps. It's actually kind of cool to check out. If you look up ecomaine's landfill on Google Maps, you can see like the satellite view, and you can see the picture of the landfill space, and you can see the closed landfill, the giant hill of old trash, and then the ash fill on the other side, and it takes up not nearly as much space. So it's kind of cool to watch, just to kind of get an idea of how much space your trash is taking up now versus 30 years ago. And we've got quite a big service area. I mentioned before that we service over 400,000 Mainers. That is, spread out throughout more than 60 towns in the state of Maine, and all of them are located here, little blips on the map. We've added a couple since then. We haven't updated the map in the last couple weeks, but we'll be adding some of these towns really soon. But we go as far north as like the Waterville and Andover area. We go as far south as Newington and Greenland, New Hampshire. So that's always kind of a fun little factoid. We service New Hampshire communities for recycling. And then we've got, a big concentration of towns in southern Maine. It makes a lot of sense for them to transport it to ecomaine versus sending things to a landfill, up north where it's a little bit more rural. These towns have a place for it to go that's pretty close. And then we've even got some communities that are islands off the coast of Maine. One of those things that you don't really think about is that if you live on an island, your trash has to go somewhere off the island. Otherwise, you're going to run out of room someday. And all those people are going to be displaced. So we've got North Haven and Vinyl Haven, and a few other island communities like Peaks Island and Chebeague. Those folks send us their recycling, and that stuff gets put onto a ferry and then driven to the mainland, and then gets a luxurious drive to Portland to our facility. So we're scattered all about the state of Maine, and we've got our owner members, which are the ones here indicated in the little green circle. Then our associates who have a really long-term contract with us. They're with us for at least 25 years. Those ones are in blue. And then our contracts are towns that sign a contract with us for 3 to 5 years. And those ones are indicated with the yellow circle. And just to give you a little bit of history, I talked about some of this already. We're municipally owned. We were started back in 1976 when the municipalities of Portland, South Portland, Cape Elizabeth, and Scarborough all were closing their municipal dumps, and they needed a place to bring all of their trash. So those 4 towns got together. They purchased a 240-acre swatch of land, and they used that to create a jointly owned landfill. So that's the landfill that we're using today, only now we're not filling it with raw trash, we're filling it with ash, and we're filling it up much, much slower than we were before. Over time, we added some more towns. So this was kind of in the mid 80s to late 80s. We added 20 municipalities, and those folks really wanted to make sure that they had a long-term solution for their waste. So they built that waste to energy power plant that we're actually sitting in right now. Lena and I are both located, in our offices in the waste to energy facility where we're burning trash just on the other side of the wall over here. So in that growing partnership, they became owners of our company, and they're actually represented in our board of directors, and they make a lot of the executive decisions for the company, including, to hire education staff like Lena and I. So those towns got together and, they built the power plant in 1988. And then in 1990, we started recycling in that old building. So like I said, we repurposed the old transfer station to process recyclables. And so that was a different process than it is today. It was source separated recycling, where you had to have a separate container for all your different types of materials. You had to have a bin at home for your paper and your glass and your metals and all of those different things. And a lot of people really had a hard time keeping that straight, and we weren't diverting as much material as we possibly could. Recycling is something that a lot of people have barriers that prevent them from recycling, and we don't want to add any more. So single sort came into the state of Maine with ecomaine. We actually changed our name to ecomaine in 2006 when we added in all of that brand new equipment. And we brought in the first single sort program. So that made it really easy for residents, whether they're recycling at a transfer station or they're recycling at home and they have curbside pickup. It made it much easier for them to just put everything in one bin, just making sure that it's clean, of course, and then sending that to ecomaine in one truck with one compartment, and then it gets sorted out once it gets here. So it saved a lot of energy and time on the residents' hands, and made it much, much easier for us to get more material, which is super important when we talk about landfills closing up and all of the environmental kind of complications that come with managing a landfill. So we really don't want to see those popping up anywhere, and recycling is definitely going to be a better solution. So we want to make it easy for people to do that. So kind of fast forwarding to the present, we've got, more than 65 municipalities that we service. And you saw all of those little blips on the map. So we're spread out pretty widely throughout the state, and we're always looking for more recycling clients. So if people are in towns that are, looking for recycling services, here we are, and we want to take your stuff and sort it just like you're going to see in just a few minutes. So before we had waste to energy technology and before we were recycling, all of our waste was taking up space in the landfills. There are lots of issues around landfilling, one being land use. It takes up a lot of space just to store trash. There's methane emissions associated with landfilling, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. It's actually about 20 to 25 times more powerful than CO2 in our atmosphere, and kind of helps us create that greenhouse effect that we don't want. So we really don't want that stuff leaching out into our air. Then there's also leachate, which is kind of like when you think about all of the wet stuff in the trash, that stuff leaches through the pile and then can kind of leach into groundwater if you're not careful. So you got to manage that, and you've got to make sure that that leachate is contained and treated correctly. There's also pests and other types of vectors when you go to a landfill. This picture right here shows it pretty clearly, but there's a lot of seagulls in this one. You can also sometimes find things like bald eagles. If you're a bird watcher, bird watching at the landfill is definitely something that's interesting to do. You can also sometimes see other types of vectors and even things like bears that are scavenging through the pile. And of course, we don't want, humans interacting with those bears or those raccoons or other animals there. But also we don't want them eating our garbage and also eating things that are toxic and harmful, or things like that are plastic that could choke them or something like that. So we want to, you know, help those animals too that might be scavengers looking for food. And lastly, landfills are really expensive to create and manage. You know, it costs a lot of money to buy that amount of space. And then to create all of the environmental protections that you need to deal with the methane and the leachate and all of that other stuff. And then you still have to manage that even once that landfill is closed. So we're still kind of stuck dealing with the landfills even decades after they're all filled up. So that's something that a lot of people don't think about when they're thinking about when they throw something away. But we want to be really mindful of that and think about the future when we're throwing stuff into the garbage. Which is why ecomaine really believes in something called the waste hierarchy. This is something that was created by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and the state of Maine has kind of adapted their own model of this as well. And ecomaine really believes in this mission, and because of that, our mission statement does really kind of explain it the best. We provide comprehensive, long-term solid waste solutions in a safe, environmentally responsible, and economically sound manner. We're also a leader in raising public awareness of sustainable waste management strategies. So we're one of the only waste management companies in the Northeast that has education staff that are dedicated to going to our communities and making sure they're doing stuff the right way. You don't see that everywhere else. You also don't see a nonprofit, municipally owned organization like us very often. So we kind of run things a little bit different here. But we really do want to preach those 3 R's. If you haven't heard the 3 R's, it's the reduce, reuse, recycle. And recycle is third for a reason. We want to make sure that we're reducing our consumption and the amount of stuff that we use more than anything else. Because if we reduce, then we see less going into the landfill, and we see less pressure on recycling systems and, you know, composting facilities, and we're just seeing less waste in general, which is good for our planet, it's good for our bodies, it's good for everything involved. So once your stuff, you collect, you're shopping, you're making packaging, and that stuff, it needs to get disposed of. It's either going to go into, you know, a drop-off container at a transfer station, kind of like the silver bullet there in the photo, or it gets picked up curbside, and that could be done by one of these trucks here. This one is a video from South Portland, I believe, and they've got a dual-sided, dual-compartment truck that's got one side for trash and one side for recycling. And then they actually have a robotic arm that can pick up those carts and just scoop the, you know, dump the contents into the back of the truck, and then pick up the trash and switch the compartment and dump that out. And it's super efficient. It keeps the truck driver safe in their car, and keeps, you know, the flow of collection going a little bit faster. If you've ever been stuck behind a trash truck, you know that sometimes that can be a slow process. But this one really, you know, it'll make that much more efficient and more and safe for the employees too. We want to keep them off the streets and out of harm's way. So that's one process of collection. And then once it gets collected, that stuff's got to go someplace. Now, ecomaine just happens to be the someplace for a lot of the stuff to go. So the trucks will dump out all their contents in the tipping hall floor here. And this video kind of shows you what happens to all of it after it arrives. So it gets dumped out on the tipping hall floor, and then a front loader here is scooping up the material and putting it onto a conveyor belt. Now, once it gets on that conveyor belt, the process to sort the material is pretty quick. It takes 3 minutes or less for that stuff. Once it starts that, you know, the ride on the conveyor belts, once that gets going, it's going to find its home in 3 minutes. Or even sooner. If it's paper or cardboard, that's the first thing that gets sorted. So it's a pretty fast process for those materials, which also means that we only have a very short window to get out any garbage or contamination that might be in there. Which is why we do take the opportunity now. We inspect every load that comes in. So if a truck driver brings in something from, you know, maybe it's coming from Old Orchard Beach, or maybe it's coming from Falmouth, every single load that comes into our recycling facility gets dumped out on the floor, and we have someone that walks around that pile, and they're looking for any sort of inappropriate items or contamination that they might have to pull out. You can see in the picture there, that's actually our CEO, Kevin Roach. He's inspecting the load that just came in on the floor, and he's looking for contamination. And you can see there's some really bulky plastics. Those are things that we don't want to sort out in our equipment. So that wouldn't be something that we could take here at the facility. There's also things like plastic bags they're going to keep an eye out for, or maybe some scary things. Sometimes we get stuff like chainsaws or laptops, you know, all sorts of kind of wonky stuff that might come into the plant that people might think is recycling and put it in there. And we tend to call that wish cycling. So if somebody's really hopeful that ecomaine can deal with it, they put it in the bin, and then it ends up kind of costing more harm than good for us. So yeah, beyond that, it's going to start going through all of the sorting equipment. The first thing that we sort out is our cardboard and our paper. And how we do that is we use a series of rubber stars. And you can see them here in the video. So the cardboard is getting sorted out with these stars. These are much bigger. These ones are about the size of a tire, and they're spinning on an axle. You can see we've got some things that are tangled up in there. So things like strapping or rope or plastic bags tend to be what we call tanglers, and they get wrapped up in those axles, and they actually make it a lot harder for us to sort out real good, you know, recycling material. You can see there's a bag of garbage that went through on top of those screens, kind of got a free ride over the top. Somebody's banner from last year's 4th of July, a bed sheet. We get all sorts of crazy stuff kind of wrapped around there. Sometimes we get things like metal cables, and that stuff's all our recycling don't. And so basically how this is working is the rubber stars are spinning really, really fast, and anything that's light, fluffy, and flat, so it's generally things like paper and cardboard, they're gonna get a free ride over the top. They just float over those stars as they're spinning. And the other containers are a little bit more three-dimensional. They're a little bit heavier. They're going to fall through those stars, and they're going to sink to the bottom. So you can see here, the paper is kind of popping up like popcorn. It looks a little chaotic. It always is super noisy in there too. But as this stuff is going through the plant, the paper floats up and everything else is sinking down. You can see we've got a second screen there. Just in case we missed anything, if something fell through that wasn't supposed to, we have a second opportunity to catch it. And the paper comes out onto one conveyor belt. The rest of the stuff keeps going on a ride through the plant to the next pieces of sorting equipment. And then the paper also gets picked through a couple more times to make sure there's no trash in it. Now you can see here, this is where we find all those tinglers. So right now it's not moving any material through, but those rubber stars are working really hard, and they've got lots of plastic bags stuck in them, which can actually create a lot of friction that could start a fire if we're not careful. So at this point, we would want to shut the equipment down, and we'd actually need to send somebody in there with box cutters to cut out the material and kind of untangle it. So a student once really gave me a good example. It's kind of like your vacuum cleaner. So if you notice that your vacuum cleaner is losing suction, it's not doing a really great job, you might unplug it and look underneath, and you're going to find all kinds of hair and string and stuff wrapped around there. And it's just like that. You're going to cut that stuff out, and then it's going to work like a charm. But it does take a little bit of elbow grease to get that stuff out and get the trash. The next process in the sorting facility is we're going to get out those metals. So attracting the right materials is pretty well said. We've got two different types of metals. We've got ferrous metals and non-ferrous metals. Our ferrous metals are things that have iron in them. So things like steel and tin cans, your soup cans, and any of that stuff. Those are going to get picked up by a magnet, just like in Toy Story 3 when Slinky gets a ride on the conveyor belt up above. It's a very similar kind of piece of technology. The magnets pick up the cans and send them away. And then we have a reverse eddy current, you can see in this video here, that kind of repels any of the non-ferrous metals. So that's stuff like our aluminum. You know, if anybody ever threw a gold watch in there, we might get that through the reverse eddy current. But we don't see too many of those. The aluminum is getting kind of projected. It's getting shot away from the conveyor belt into the right container. It kind of looks like it's shooting hoops with our soda cans. We also take things like aluminum foil and baking trays and like pie plates and things like that. We just want to make sure that they don't have, you know, fish skin or you know, pizza crust inside them, or you know, a key lime pie or anything. We don't want any of that stuff in the metal. And then after we sort out the metals, we've already taken out the cardboard, the paper, and the two different types of metals, both ferrous and non-ferrous. Now we're gonna get the glass out. And how that works is we have a closed box, so I don't have a video to share, unfortunately, but the glass gets shattered in a closed metal box with metal stars. So very similar to the rubber stars that we saw that sorted out the paper and the cardboard, these metal stars will send plastic over the top, and they'll shatter the glass jars and bottles. And once that glass gets shattered, we want to make sure it's ground up and not too sharp to the touch. So it goes into a trommel where we ground it down a little bit more. And then once it's the right size, it's going to go into a storage container. And then we actually store that in big piles at our landfill, where companies can come and take it for free. So this is part where, you know, people's creativity can really be useful here. We have reused our glass to make things like countertops, or to replace gravel. We use it instead of using gravel on our landfill roads sometimes, or they can use it for clean fill for development sites. They can use it for trailblazing. They can use it to fill up potholes if they needed to. It's something that we allow people to come and take if they have a big project, and we stockpile it. We get a huge amount, and then people can come by the dump truck load and take that glass. So that's what we do with it right now. Of course, if you can reuse your glass bottles and jars, we encourage that because we want to make sure that they get a lot of uses before they get disposed of. So I know I personally like to hoard my glass bottles and jars, and I reuse them for, you know, when I get dry goods at the grocery store, or I can, you know, use my old glass jar as a cup for my toothbrush. So just finding creative ways to repurpose things and give them a new life before we throw them into the recycling bin or the trash can. So that's what happens with our glass. The pictures on the bottom corner are actually really helpful. This bathroom sink here is actually at ecomaine. We've got 315 bottles and jars that made that countertop, and that's our bathroom sinks there. We have a kitchen cabinet or countertop that's made out of over 1,000 bottles and jars, and they use concrete to kind of hold all that stuff together. And I think the company that made that one's called Beachstone, but I'm not 100% sure. And then pictures of the little roadways that are using crushed glass as an aggregate. All right, and then after we've sorted out all of the, you know, the paper, the cardboard, the metals, the glass, the last thing that we need to process in the facility is our plastics. And plastics can be tricky, and a lot of people have questions about how to recycle plastics and which plastics to recycle. So I'll talk a little bit in just a minute about, you know, tools that we have for you if you have questions about those types of items. So plastic sorting happens according to a resin code. So if you have a plastic container, I'm gonna see if I have one anywhere in here right now. Oh yeah, right here. So I've got this container with wipes, and plastics have to pass a 3-question test in order to be recycled at ecomaine. I'll go over that now, and then we'll talk about, you know, why certain resin codes go certain places. But it has to have that symbol on it. So the symbol with the number inside, this is a number 2 HDPE plastic. It says so right on the bottom. It's got the symbol, so it passes one test. The second test is it a rigid plastic? So it's got to be a hard plastic, not a soft and squishy plastic. If I can crumple it all the way in my hand, it's not rigid enough to recycle. So this one passes that test. It's a nice sturdy hard plastic. And then the last question is it a container? So this has wipes inside. It's a container for wipes. Let's say I wanted to recycle my lid by itself. This might also be a number 2, or no, it's a number 5 plastic. It says so on the lid. This one by itself would not belong in the recycling bin. And basically the reason for that is because our rubber stars that are sorting out our paper do a really good job of picking up light, fluffy, and flat things. And plastic lids tend to act just like paper in our screens. So they float right up and over the top, and they end up contaminating our paper bales. So we want those lids to stay on the container, and then they can get recycled correctly. Even if they might be 2 different plastics, like this is a 2 and this is a 5, it's still okay because they're both plastic and they'll both get chopped up and pelletized and then processed in plastics, versus this going into a paper bale and then being pulped up like paper. This wouldn't do a good job becoming paper pulp. So those are our 3 questions. It's got to have the number, it's got to be a rigid plastic, and it's got to be a container. So the resin code down below, so that number, we take numbers 1 through 7, which is all the numbers. It goes, 1 through 7, and 7 is other. So it's got to have one of those symbols on it, but that basically means that it's got a certain type of chemical in it. So number 2 plastics all have the same type of chemicals. This is a high density polyethylene, which is what HDPE stands for. And that means that these need to go and be recycled with the other number 2 HDPE containers, because they have the same melting point, and they can turn into the same things. So they want to be separated by those numbers. And in order for us to do that, we need to make sure that it has that symbol on it as well. These ones are done manually. The number 2 plastics are sorted out by hand. And then we've got some other pieces of technology that sort out some of the different numbers. So our 3 through 7s are all sorted out manually in our plant. And then things like plastic water bottles or a salad box, or if you're getting strawberries this time of year because they're in season, you're going to see those plastic containers for strawberries. Those ones are all made out of number 1 plastic. And you can tell when you look in the symbol, it's going to have that number 1 right there. It's a PET container. So for PET containers, the number 1s, we sort things a little bit differently, and I've got a video to show. If it'll play. Maybe not. Let's try going back and coming to it again. Oh boy. That's all right. I can just explain it if it doesn't work. Maybe it will. We've learned nothing else in light of everything that's going on. It's how to be flexible about technology. So I'm not sure if that's going to work, so I'll just explain it, and then if it does decide that it wants to work, then that's great too. So this container right here, I have my little hand sanitizer bottle. This is a number 1. Of course, I'd want this to be empty if I were to recycle it, and I can explain that in a second. But let's say I emptied this one and maybe took off the pump because the pump has metal and stuff in there, which would make it not recyclable. So I'm going to take that container when it's empty and I put that in the recycling bin. And as it's on the conveyor belt, we have an optical sorter that's scanning the plastic. And the different numbered plastics mean that they have different chemicals in them. So a number 1 is unique to number 1 plastics. No other plastics have the same chemicals inside. So as this thing's on the conveyor belt, it's scanning and it's looking for that number 1 plastic. It's looking for the chemicals that make it up. So as this is going, it's going to recognize the chemicals. It's going to know that this is a number 1. And then what's going to happen is it's actually going to shoot a little puff of air to project it into the right container. So it just gives it that little jet, to send it on the right direction. The rest of the stuff, it doesn't get that puff of air. It's just going to keep on going through the plant. And then it's going to go into this room that you can see the picture in the slide, where they'll get manually sorted. So that's where they sort out the number 2 plastics and the number 3 through 7s. So this one just happens to get the really cool piece of technology that's scanning the plastics and then giving them a little puff of air to project them away. We could do that maybe someday if we had, the money and the space to actually have a different optical sorter for all the different types of plastics. We could do that someday, but those are very expensive pieces of technology. I believe when we purchased our first optical sorter, it cost us about $250,000. So it's basically the cost of a mortgage these days. So it's pretty expensive, and that technology is pretty state of the art. We have seen, the future of waste management is using robots to pick out different types of materials. So that could be really interesting someday. But for now, we're gonna do it by hand. And it doesn't look like that one's gonna play, so we'll just skip it. And lastly, once we've sorted out everything here in the plant, we've taken out all the plastics, everything sits in its own container until it gets full. And then once we have enough of a material, once things start kind of getting overwhelming with the amount of milk jugs or the amount of plastic water bottles that we're getting, we're gonna send that down into our baler. And this is the original baler that used to squish up all of the trash. So this baler here is squishing up all of the different types of recycling, and it's wrapping them in a metal wire so that they hold their shape. And then our buddy Richard here, he drives the forklift. He's just giving that a little bit of a flip. He's visually inspecting, and he wants to make sure that there's no trash on the outside, because trash on the outside means that there's probably a lot of trash on the inside and that we didn't do a good enough job sorting out all of the stuff that was in the bale. So we might have to cut that open and send it through again if it seems like there's maybe too much garbage. So you can see he's pulling out a couple things. It looks like he found some plastic bags, which are not recyclable at ecomaine. So he's pulling those off and making sure that those go in the trash. And then he's, luckily to, this video, we caught a truck day. So this is an order coming in for cardboard. So he's gonna drive those bales of cardboard right into the back of a truck and fill that guy right up. And then they're gonna send that to maybe New York, maybe Massachusetts, maybe Pennsylvania, to go to another plant where they're gonna turn that into brand new cardboard. We also have all of the other bales that sit out there in storage until we're ready. We need probably, I think, at least 8 of those giant cubes. And it depends on weight too, because trucks can only carry so much weight. So we wait until we have enough of a material, and then we try to find an order for it where it can go to a manufacturer to turn into brand new good stuff. So for examples of things that your recycling turns into, when you recycle your newspapers, you can make things like berry boxes or egg cartons. You can get kitty litter that's made out of recycled newspaper. You can get paper plates or other types of paper products. Buying recycled is also super important. So when we buy recycled stuff, we actually create a home for this stuff when we are recycling it at ecomaine. So when you're buying a or you're buying a notebook that's made of 100% recycled paper, that paper had to come from somewhere. So it could have come from ecomaine. So buying things that are recycled is a really great way to help, support your local recyclers, because then it makes sure that there's somebody out there who wants that recycled paper. Your plastics, things like milk jugs and your orange juice bottles and those kinds of plastic containers, those can turn into 5-gallon buckets or frisbees or playground equipment, or maybe you get an Adirondack chair that could be made out of milk jugs, or plastic laundry detergent bottles. We have some cool little examples of that here too. I don't think I have any in here with me, but yeah, so we can get plastic lumber that's made out of milk jugs. If you've ever been to some of the beaches in South Portland, Willard Beach actually has a playground on the beach that's made entirely out of recycled milk jugs. So that's pretty cool. And then for metal, you can also just smelt that down and recycle it into brand new metal containers, or automotive parts or other types of scrap metal. If you have questions about whether or not something is recycled or recyclable or not, we have a couple of resources for you. First one is the rule of plastics. We've got that 3-question test that will really help you to remember which plastics are recyclable and which ones are not. So remembering, does that item have a number 1 through 7 on it? Is that plastic container, is it a rigid and hard plastic, or is it a squishy and rippy and stretchy plastic like a plastic bag? If it's one of those, then we can't take it. We want those really rigid and hard containers. And then, is it a container? So we want to make sure we're not just getting all kinds of lids, because those lids will end up in our paper. And then if you really aren't sure and you want to ask a question about a really specific material, you can check out our Recyclopedia. So that's the ecomaine Recyclopedia. It's kind of like a recycling encyclopedia all merged together. And you can search from up to 1,300 items right now. And we add more and more all the time as people suggest items. If you search something and it doesn't exist in our database yet, you can suggest it and we'll get right to work and try to find an answer for you. So using that resource is something that will help you recycle better and keep the recycling clean so that we can always find homes for it to make sure it actually gets turned into something new and useful. And thank you so much for your time. We appreciate, everyone taking the time to learn more about where their recycling goes. If you have other questions or want to schedule a program for maybe an organization that you work with, or maybe want to get some of this education at work or at school or anywhere in your community where you might be, feel free to reach out to us and request some educational services. Lena and I are both here full-time offering educational opportunities for the public, both virtual, and we're trying to work out how we're going to do this in person in light of everything that's going on with COVID. So we're flexible, and we really want to make sure that everyone's recycling right and doing it well, and your questions are being answered. We don't want any more wish cycling. So feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to help. And we'd love to help, get you set up with a recycling program if you don't already have one. So please reach out to us, and your contact information for ecomaine is right here. So please feel free to take a screenshot or, just jot it down on a piece of paper, but reach out to us with any questions that you might have. All right, and thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn more about where your recycling goes. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to us by phone or by email or at any of our social media accounts. We love getting messages from you. We'd also love to get some feedback on what types of programs you'd like to see, both on social media or on Zoom calls like this. So let us know what you'd like to see, and we'll make it work. All right, thanks guys.